Welcome, everyone. And I think I'm just going to add a welcome to Diana's. And we sometimes invoke just how much pleasure the four of us have found in exploring the suttas together, and particularly in making them an alive part of our practice. That's kind of the motivating spirit behind this series of practice and study and practice classes. Yeah, sort of a commitment to bringing these suttas to life in our practice and sharing that pleasure and the benefit of that with others. So we do this anyway, but we love to invite others to join us and share it and contribute. So welcome. I'll pass it on to Ying.
Yeah, just so delighted to see many of you who we've seen in the Society Center classes that the four of us teach over the years, and some new faces. Just a warm welcome. As my co-teachers shared the delight of us exploring this together, I hope, this week as we explore this is often attributed as the first discourse, and we'll elaborate a little bit about that, and of the Buddha. And we hope to kind of just invite some curiosity and
No, I had that happen once, and when
so I just invite some curiosity and aliveness into this examination of kind of ancient teaching here. So I'll pass it on to Kim.
Yeah, thank you. It's always a joy to see all these faces pop up on the screen. And I'll just echo the sentiments of my co-teachers in the wonder of sharing what we share among ourselves. And maybe I'll just turn us toward this particular sutta for a moment. In that when we've all read the sutta many times, it's about the Four Noble Truths. Everyone hears that in the, near the beginning of their Dharma adventure. And we discovered so much in this relatively short discourse just in talking about it. And so we hope to discover even more as we share it with more people and have a chance to talk about it more among all of you. So once again, reminded of the richness of these teachings. So please join us on this adventure. I'll pass it back to
you. Yeah, thanks, Kim. So yeah, this is I would say about the sutta, which is sometimes referred to as the Buddha's first sermon. And again, we'll comment a bit about that as we go forward. It was such a delight to reread it. And I think one of the things we'd love to instill in others is this sense of how much is in these suttas and how much they repay revisiting. So we're looking at something quite familiar, but as each of the four of us and together reprocess together, all this new stuff starts to happen. So it appears to be perhaps a sutta about the Four Noble Truths, but I think we could say that it really goes deeper than that. It's about the transformative power of deeply, fully engaging with the Four Noble Truths. And it talks a little bit about how we might go around doing that. One way, at any rate, that we could bring certain kinds of attention, certain kinds of even rigor to our meeting our experience in ways that are transformative. So, and again, there's not just the Four Noble Truths here. There's also the middle path. There's these very specific tasks that pertain to each of the Four Noble Truths. And at the end, there's devas. We got all sorts of stuff going on here. This is a sutta that's not rich in metaphor, simile, as some of the suttas are that we've discussed, but hey, there's devas. And we'll talk a little bit about why they appear. So it takes a lot to turn this wheel of the Dharma, but once it's begun turning, it can't be stopped. That is one of the most forceful teachings of this sutta. once we begin this practice, once we engage with it fully and seriously, it can't be stopped. That's a lovely promise, and something that's really, I can feel moves me as I give voice to that sense of what's available here in this very brief, kind of dry, perhaps, sutta. And so anyway, welcome in exploring it with us. And we'll start with a first formal teaching from Diana.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So first, I'd like to start by unpacking the title of this sutta. It's often translated as like turning the wheel of the Dharma. In Pali, it's Dhamma Chakka Pavatana. And this class won't have a lot of Pali, don't worry, for those of you who are a little bit uncomfortable with that. But I wanted to say a few words here about this word, like maybe each word. So Dharma, Dhamma, is often we think of this as the teachings or as the doctrine. But in ancient India at this time, there was this idea that there was this natural, harmonious way in which the world worked. And each individual, each person had a duty or a responsibility to maintain that harmony. And this was their Dharma. So often, kind of like in ancient India at the time of the Buddha, a person's Dharma was the way, the way they fit in with the whole flow of the universe or something like this. So that was the context in which the Buddha was teaching. But we know now, like that he like redefined that and looked at this word Dharma differently. And not in this particular sutta, but in other suttas, we know that the Dharma was characterized as something that is visible, with an invitation to come and experience for oneself, and is a way that might be translated as the way things are, but it was more a sense of being tuned in with what your actual experience is. So the Buddha Dharma, we might say, has a few meanings. One is the teachings attributed to the Buddha, but also this way of being present and for one's experience and aligned with what's actually happening. And some of you might be familiar with this expression, ehipassiko, like come and see. That was kind of this idea of the Dharma, come and see how things are. So that's what we could say is the first word in this title, Dhammacakkappavattana. And the second word is chakka, which is wheel. And just as David was talking about earlier, it's this idea that that a wheel is something that like moves, that goes from like one place to another. But this word chakka can also mean like sphere or circle or discus, has this sense of roundness, which can have a sense of complete, like a round, something that's round is complete. It's like perfected in some kind of way. It's symmetrical, and we might use this word harmonious again. But I really like that the also chakka can also mean, in the sense of sphere, could also mean like ball. And I'll come back to this in a moment. So then we come to the third word, pavatana, setting in motion. So we could also like set turning, but maybe get rolling. So often this sutta is translated as setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. Great translation, really kind of like has a sense of what it is. Or we might say setting the wheel of Dharma in motion, or rolling forth the wheel of Dharma. But recently there's been somebody who's translated this as getting the Dharma ball rolling, getting the ball rolling. And I love this, right? This is a way that it feels approachable, and it feels like, okay, something that involves people, I don't know, getting the ball rolling. I kind of feel like, just this movement. And the Dharma wheel is this movement towards more and more freedom and ease and well-being. there's also this way, I kind of feel like getting the ball rolling is has less a sense of heavy-handed, dogmatic. Instead, it feels a little bit more personable. So, as David said, the sutta does have 3 primary elements. And I'll say there's this discussion about the middle way. There's a discussion about the Four Noble Truths. And then I'll say, we could say this third element is what happens after the Buddha gives the teaching, the middle way and the Four Noble Truths. And during this class, we'll be unpacking these different elements. And so the Theravada tradition holds that this was the first teaching of the Buddha. After his awakening, this was the first teaching. And some people would say that it's actually maybe even the first in importance, because it lays down this fundamental teaching, this foundational teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And in fact, in some Theravada countries, maybe all Theravada countries, they celebrate a Salapuja Day, otherwise known as Dharma Day. And it's this festival that commemorates this sutta, this teaching. And often there's, celebrations. There's people will go to the monastery. They will listen to talks. They will listen to the monastics are chanting this sutta on this day. And it happens on the first full moon, on the 8th month of the year, which is usually July. And this year it's July 10th. So in places like Thailand and Burma and Laos and Cambodia, Sri Lanka, this will be a big festival that is really focused around this sutta, this starting the teachings, and in particular this one. There's a lot of like processions maybe, or people making offerings or circumambulating around temples or pagodas or this type of thing. And we could also say even just more broadly that this celebration, Dharma Day, is a celebration of beginnings. So for many people, it's like an auspicious day to begin a new venture. If you want to start something new, to do it on Dharma Day, which is the full moon in July. So that's kind of like a traditional view of about this sutta. And then there's more secular views also, which we find more, here in the West. We tend to have a little bit more secular view. And Richard Gombrich, who's a scholar for early Buddhism, he says, well, this sutta kind of reads less like the first presentation of ideas and more like a set of formulas that get put forth. And so in his mind, looking at me, he says, well, it feels more like, and just the way it is organized and some of the details that are there and some of the details that aren't there, says, well, it seems like it's actually referring to teachings that are already established. So this is something that Richard Gombrich would say. And Johannes Bronkhorst, who's another scholar, and he has looked at some of the other parallels to this sutta. So some of you might be familiar with this idea of parallels. That is, we have this sutta that exists in the Pali Canon, but there are other canons from other early Buddhist schools that also have this sutta in their Pali Canon, and not Pali Canon, in their canon, which was preserved in Sanskrit and translated into Chinese or Tibetan. And just maybe I'll back up a little bit and say in the Pali Canon, this sutta occurs in 3 different places. First, in the one that we're going to be looking at in this class. I shouldn't say second, I should say 2. Also in the Vinaya. But in the Vinaya, this is the teachings for the monastics. It's a little bit different. Maybe I'll just say briefly, it's stuck in there with the story of the Buddha's awakening. Because this is the first teaching. So, and the story of the Buddha's awakening is often described in as Majjhima 26, Arya Pariyesam Sutta, that Noble Search. And then it continues in the Vinaya, continues from where that sutta ends and goes into the first teaching that the Buddha gave. So it's this longer story put together. And then the third place that it exists in the Pali Canon is in the Parisamhita, which is the path of discrimination kind of tucked in there in the Khuddaka Nikaya. Just even recently just translated into English. It's something that hasn't been emphasized in either practitioners or scholars so much. So the Pali Canon has it in 3 different places. And then there's parallels that we find in like other early Buddhist traditions other than Theravada. And some of these parallels don't even have the Four Noble Truths in it. So they're prescribed to be in the first teaching, and yet they don't even have what we think is the foundational teaching. So this is another way that scholars have looked at this and said, well, maybe it's the first teaching and maybe it isn't. And then Anolio, who some of you might be familiar with, Bhikkhu Anolio, points out that, well, maybe there would be the narrative logic might make sense if things were organized a little bit differently or something like this. So we'll never know. We'll never know whether these are the Buddha's first words, and that's okay. I would say, and that's okay. Like, what is it in us that feels like we want to have some clarity and we want to feel like, oh no, this is actually is the first one or something like that. Like sometimes we notice how we want things to be clear and have some authority or something like this. So whatever the teachings are, whether this is the first teachings or not, I feel like it's still relevant today. Even, it's all these thousands of years ago, and there might be some ambiguity between what the tradition holds and what scholar holds, but it focuses on the common feature of life, suffering, dukkha. Like this is like a central part of this sutta, this not only this dukkha, but the wish to be free from it, the search to be free from it. And so this is a way in which the Buddha's first teaching maybe is, I know for me, I'll just say personally, this whole idea is difficulties and how to be free from them really is a big part of what attracted me to even the Buddhist practice to begin with and the Buddhist teachings to begin with. And as David said, the teachings are a point to that we could say maybe a guide or a manual rather than a proclamation of like, okay, here's the Dharma, as a philosophical treatise. We could approach it as he's not talking about some philosophical or metaphysical ideas. Instead, he's pointing to, well, actually, these teachings need to be put into practice. There is not about adopting a belief system. It's not about, well, here's what's going to happen after death or, something like that. Instead of, here's something tangible that we all experience, this difficulties, and then he's offering, well, here's something to do about it. And maybe it's, for me, I feel touched by, I don't, of course, know if it's true, but here is somebody who is, his first teachings, what he thinks is going to be the most helpful, or what he learned that felt like that could be the most impactful from his journey of becoming awakening. So maybe this whole sense of getting the ball rolling, maybe it evokes this sense of putting things into practice, trying out the teachings. And so it's not that we're like standing around and admiring the wheel or something like this. Wheels are great. We use them all the time, but it's more that sense of something being in motion. And it's being in motion from being rolled from one person to the next or something like this. And maybe I'll close with this quote from Bhikkhu Sujatu, who says, "When you take this teaching to heart, it gets behind the steering wheel of the engine that's been driving your life." I kind of like this idea, put us behind the steering wheel. So all these creative ways in which we might understand this idea of wheel. So with that, I'll pass it on to David.
One of the joys of teaching in a team or this team is how much is learned. I got all these ideas from Diana. Really wonderful sort of first opening up of this sutta. And you say guide, and you also sort of implicitly you say that it's an invitation in a way. The Buddha says, this is what I discovered about how to engage with my experience of suffering that I found freeing. And can you understand it? Or what would it be like if you were to take on some of this approach? So it has this feeling of invitation too, which I think lends it power. And it's all these things. I love the steering wheel. I'm still working with that. So now we'd like to invite you to talk a little amongst yourselves in breakout rooms, small groups, to take up this idea. I said at the beginning, and I want to correct myself, that there's no metaphors. I mean, the wheel of the Dharma is a metaphor. Duh. It's in fact central to this. So I'd like to expunge the record if we could go back and take that out of the recording. I'd appreciate it. That was silly of me. But what is it like to take this idea of the wheel set in motion, or a steering wheel, or a wheel turning that's beautiful and maybe scatters light in a way that's refreshing and provides insight? Any number of ways to take on this metaphor. And sort of amongst yourselves in small groups, think about this question with one another. How does the Dharma wheel turn in your life and practice? What's your sense? In what ways do you feel in your practice this sense of motion, this sense of momentum, this sense of engagement that frees? However you make sense of it. We sort of want to start with this before we get into analyzing it much more, just so that you can sort of bring it into your minds in this way. So that's the question. How does the Dharma wheel turn in your life and practice? And I think everyone here kind of knows our ground rules for the breakout groups. We like to put this forward as a way to support one another's practice and listen and hear one another. So, maybe don't say everything you could say as the ball comes around to you, as the circle turns of the conversation. Just maybe adding one thing about how this shows up in your life, how you would respond to this question, and letting it kind of circle around. Why don't we start? We tend to start at the beginning or the end of the alphabet. Radical notion is to start in the middle today. So whoever's name begins closest to M, I think that's the middle of the alphabet, could start the conversation. You'll have about 12 minutes. We hope you enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you back here. Welcome back to the early arrivals.
Susan, I think I saw that you were ended up in a room by yourself, right? I'm sorry about no. Oh, the people had already come back here. Got it.
All right, here we are. Welcome back, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, Looks like everybody's here. Nobody rolled away on a Dharma wheel. Everybody made it back. Yeah, so we're really curious to learn anything about what came up in your groups, any questions that arose, any interesting reflections that it would be useful to share with the group. And you know the drill, raise your Zoom hand. Or if you're unable to find the Zoom hand, if it moves around sometimes, feel free to wave a hand. I actually can see everybody. Can see everybody here. Yeah, so any questions, any reflections to share? Oh, Damon.
Yeah, thanks, David. I just want to report, our pod had a very rich discussion, and one of the themes that's resonating with me is about being in pain, chronic, physical pain, illness, and how those of us on the path could actually take that as, a means of liberation to take the illness onto the path. So if you could say more about that.
Yeah, let me because I think she's quite expert in this. Let me ask if Ying might respond to that.
Yeah, I think what Damon you pointed out is really what this Four Noble Truth is also being pointing to. It's pointing to, right? And this we will be moving into that. I guess rolling into that in a little while, briefly. There's a sense of in the human body, embodied this way, there's a sense of the inevitability of we will be encountering discomfort and pain, and yet how we relate to it, is where we can potentially find freedom. I think you yourself mentioned this to some degree. Is it easy? No, not at all. And this is why the fourth noble truth of cultivating, developing our heart and mind comes in. And so this is a practice, and there is a practice, there is a way, there is a training in this. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I just turn to any of my co-teachers who might say anything to this.
Diana, Kim, anything to add? Yeah. I think a lot of people in our circuit, a certain number of people, come to this path of practice through chronic illness, chronic pain, and it proves to be, a very effective way, as Ying says, to hold and meet and hold those experiences. You could say that the path of practice is developed to meet these challenges in life. It works fine in good times, but particularly seems to be particularly well designed for meeting illness, old age, and death. Illness, old age, dying, and death. So stay tuned. Francesca.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to insert one.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Diana.
Tomorrow, our next class, we'll talk a little bit more about this, like specifically, like how to do it when we talk about some of the, as we unpack the Four Noble Truths. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, so Francesca.
In our group, everyone came by a different path. One was reading, and one just jumped in the meditation. Nobody was looking for a life free of pain. But still, all those in the group acknowledge that we have received benefits from this path in our lives. And that's probably why I continue, because I felt the benefits of following this path, this spiritual path. And so I'm just questioning myself right now if in this course or the ones we're gonna check on this training, if you can shed some light, if there's anywhere where the Buddha says, if you start meditating, then your life is going to be better because you won't be fighting with others, or you will get better with your friends. And because that's what we had. We had people that had very accidents in their life, and we also went through COVID, and certainly this Dharma helped us. That was my share.
Nice. Thank you. Thanks for kind of posing an interesting and useful question there. And without, as Diana said, it's funny, we don't want to say, oh, we're going to get to that too much. But I think this too, we will get into a little bit. And maybe just for a brief and maybe a little glib answer, yeah, it's not just that we start meditating and then freedom appears. At least this sutta seems to indicate that it's how we meditate, how we meet the experience of suffering, and sort of how deeply we penetrate it and allow it to penetrate us, and how we learn from that experience of how suffering arises, how suffering ceases. So it's and I think it was Ying who said, it sounds simple, but it's not easy. We say this quite a bit, and so it's not as simple as just starting. It's more that deep engagement creates a momentum that can't be stopped. So I think we'll particularly on Thursday, we'll get into the kind of how what this sutta says about what kind of engagement. Kim, Ying, Diana, anything else on that?
I can add a couple words. Sometimes a challenge with the translation of dukkha as suffering is that it sounds very dramatic, or it sounds also like something that is happening to us. And there are forms of suffering like that, such as old age, illness, death, pain, these kinds of things that we don't have a choice about when we, have an embodied life. And there are also forms of suffering that we are participating in, let's say, through unconscious habits, through the way we're mental patterns that we're just running in our life. And so those maybe start to point toward what you pointed to, Francisca, is that if we naturally notice those and stop putting energy into them, then there are aspects of our life that go better. Our relationships, our job, our way of meeting our everyday life, and even deeper things. So, again, not to point too much toward the future, but understanding what dukkha is and the different elements of it and the different aspects of it, we'll start to see, oh, there are ways in which I can stop participating in this. And that starts to point toward these benefits. The Buddha, I'll speak in a moment about how the Buddha says this points toward peace as one of the fruits of engaging with this practice. And peace includes these aspects of our life that you pointed to, Francisca.
Nice, Kim. Thank you. We have time, I think, for one more question, one more reflection. But maybe we're satisfied where we are. Is anything else coming up for anyone else? Lee.
It was interesting, the question about the wheel, because I had always focused on the setting in motion, the verbal aspect of it, rather than the noun aspect of it. And it seemed to me that like this sutta is the stuff you need to know to get going on the path. You need these signposts, which are nouns, but this is how you get it going, is some understanding of this part. And so thank you for putting some emphasis on the wheel part of it, because as was mentioned in the group, a wheel has momentum and it keeps going by itself if you give it a good enough push. And that's definitely what I found in my own practice when I got started.
Nice. Appreciate that. And as we'll see, again, we keep saying we're as we'll see, but yeah, in this case, the wheel as a noun, and maybe separate from the wheel as metaphor, it could also be read, and Diana didn't introduce this, but as a matrix of a way of saying 4 times 3, 4 noble truths crossed with 3 different ways to meet each of them. And so it had at the time that sort of meaning, and that's another way to sort of make sense of what's being set in motion, and what once set in motion can't be stopped. So thank you for that rich discussion, those questions and reflections, Lee, Francisca, and Damon. And let me turn it over to Kim.
Great, thank you. So I want to speak a little bit now about getting into the text of this sutta. Let's start looking at what it says. So in this talk, we're going to look somewhat carefully at just the beginning of this discourse. And I understand that many of you may not have the text in front of you or have even read it. We're going to give you at the end of this class a link to that. Or maybe it was sent in advance, I'm not sure. But anyway, you'll be able to read it for yourself. So at the beginning of this discourse, the Buddha uses a particular term. He uses the term the middle way or the middle path. And it's important to be clear about this key term. It's said right up front and then kind of unfolded throughout the text. So we wanted to look at that a little bit more carefully. So I want to just read what Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of the beginning, where the Buddha leads off by talking about 2 extremes not to be pursued. So it says, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What 2? The pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial. And the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata, that's the Buddha, has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. So there's a lot of words in there, and we'll kind of talk through. So he criticizes 2 extremes, first of all, one being the pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, and the other being the pursuit of self-mortification. And this word pursuit could also be translated as indulgence in some other translations. So we get a sense of going too far or pursuing a little bit too enthusiastically, something like that. So we have to remember that he gave this discourse to his 5 former ascetic companions. That's the setting, is that he taught this to people that he used to practice with who were doing very extreme austerities in their practice. And so I imagine that they were very happy when he starts off saying, the extreme of sensual indulgence should not be pursued. And they all said, yeah, that's right. And then he said, or the extreme of self-mortification. And they probably all said, huh, what? And sat up straight. He suddenly turned the tables on them a little bit. So that's skillful on the Buddha's part. He draws them in and then he says, and what you're doing is an extreme also. So we may recognize, okay, yeah, this sense pleasure thing, we can have questions about that, and that does need to be unpacked also for us as lay people. But we might kind of dismiss this second extreme of self-mortification, because most of us are not living that way, any of us probably. And yet, I think we have an echo of this extreme in our mental life, in our self-criticism, our self-diminishment, various ways in which we judge ourselves or treat ourselves badly in mental ways. So that is pointing to that extreme. And although this text is directed then to monastics, I think it's not only for literal monastics, it's for all of us on the spiritual path, and that we all may have to look at both of those extremes. So, what does he say about these extremes? First of all, he says that they are unbeneficial, and other translations say that they're pointless or unprofitable, for that word, as well as painful, low, vulgar, etc. And maybe the thing to ask is, if we spend our life directed toward either just getting more enjoyment in various ways or gathering more stuff for ourselves, or the opposite, being down on ourselves, criticizing ourselves, or living in kind of, restricted, pinched ways of various kinds, there's kind of no end to those pursuits. They just feed on themselves. They don't really go anywhere. We may see in our own life, if we're more on the, say, the indulgence side, when's it going to be enough? When do we decide that we have enough, or that we've done enough, or that we've become enough? Something like that. There's a way that these things always, each one gives way to just wanting the next thing. So, and the other thing that we do sometimes is we veer from one of these to the other. So, as a kind of a concrete example, maybe we decide that we're too indulgent with sugar. So we declare that we're going to eliminate sugar from our diet for 6 months. But after 2 weeks, maybe we decide it's okay to have just one cookie, and so on. So, we kind of veer from just saying, all right, I'm just going to do it, to, no, I'm never going to do it again. And we can see that this kind of action is not really following a path. So then the Buddha talks about this middle way. And it can be easy to say, well, the middle way is therefore kind of a middling approach. It's not too much of one thing, it's not too much of the other thing. We could call this the Goldilocks idea of the middle way. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, but it's just right. And we can be satisfied with that idea. But I think we should be careful with the Goldilocks interpretation of the middle way. One challenge we have when Dharma terms overlap with words in ordinary English, like the middle way or the happy medium, let's say, is that we may assume that the Dharma term is the same as the everyday term. And in the case of the middle way, there are some differences, and it's useful to look more carefully at what's going on. So in the sutta, the Buddha then goes on to state what is the middle way. So I'll read that part too. He says, and what is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision and which leads to Nibbana? It is this noble eightfold path. That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, knowledge, and leads to peace, direct knowledge, enlightenment, and Nibbana. I read all that again to really hear the power of that. So the middle way is the Eightfold Path. I don't think we get all those amazing things just by not having too many cookies, right? So it's not quite this idea of just going through, not too much sense pleasure, not too much austerity. I'm going to say that the Eightfold Path is a third option. It's more stable and it's more fruitful. It's actually a different way of being. So what is a possible image here besides just going down the middle? So you can imagine, like maybe the mind comes up with, oh, there's a path that's clear down the middle and there's brambles on either side. And the middle way is that we just walk down that middle path without the obstacles. But I think this gives the wrong impression that maybe the path is what's easy to do, because it's hard to walk through brambles and it's easy to walk, down the middle. But, maybe when the mind is well developed, that's true. But because the path is then the only way that feels open to us. But before that, like when we're getting the wheel rolling still, I think we experience the path as somewhat challenging to follow compared to how easy it is to just fall into our habitual ruts in the mind. So I'm going to offer a different image, which is that the path consists of a clear area that's enveloped by fog on each side. And the clear area has some sharp stones and some obstacles and some muddy patches, but at least we can see them. And what we usually do is decide, I don't want to walk on that, so we just stumble into the fog, and then we run into things. And, it feels maybe smoother when we first put our foot down, but eventually we run into all kinds of painful things, and we fall off cliffs and things like that when we're on the foggy part. And we would need to consciously choose, I'm going to walk in the clear area that has the sharp stones and the muddy patches. So, we can often see or sense this path then as something to aim for, just as slipping over into the fogged area feels easier, but it's not as clear. So, for example, you may, to make this kind of a concrete example, you may have had an experience of knowing that you needed to act with integrity in some situation, but kind of not wanting to have that difficult conversation and not wanting to speak out in some way. The path is clear, but doing it is not an easy walk. And yet you can then decide, all right, I'm not gonna go with what I know needs to be done. So this middle way is maybe something more subtle than just halfway, or just a milder approach, or just a middling approach that's nice and gentle. I think it's actually a whole different realm of action that's being pointed to here. So it's a third way, let's say. So then we get some more information about this path by what comes next. This is the way that leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to nibbana. So the middle way is what goes in that direction, and it means doing actions that are appropriate for such a goal. That's where it's going. So that I use the word appropriate deliberately because that word that I repeated again and again is right view, right intention, right speech. Sometimes people react a little bit against right because it's like right and wrong, and we have too much of that self-judgment. But this word right is a translation of samma in Pali. And probably a better translation is something like appropriate. Right as in appropriate, like the right tool. You don't use, if you want to pound in a nail, you use a hammer. You don't use, I don't know, a yoga mat or something like that. So it can mean appropriate, and I think that's a good translation. Another thing it can mean, and this is going to hark back to Diana's talk, is that samma can mean complete. So complete view, complete intention, in sense, a fullness to it, a wholeness to it, like the wheel. And this then ties in with many of these ancient Indian ideas of harmonious, of true, of complete. Sometimes you'll hear teachers translate samma in the modern world as wise view, wise intention. I think that's okay in the spirit of it, but it's not really in the word roots there. So we see that the Eightfold Path consists of view and intention, which are considered parts of wisdom, speech, action, and livelihood, considered parts of ethical conduct, and then effort, mindfulness, and concentration, which are considered parts of mental development or samadhi. And we'll talk in more detail about each of this division of the path and kind of each of these areas in the next session. So I'll just end with one other thing about this beginning section that lays out the two extremes, the middle path, and this sense that it's the Eightfold Path, which is that all of this gives pride of place to the fourth noble truth. We haven't even gotten to the noble truths yet, but as a preview, the path is the fourth of the four truths, and yet the Buddha starts with it. So one way to interpret this is that the goal of Buddhist practice is not a complete philosophy or a perfect doctrine. Again, pointing to what Diana said, it's not ontology, it's not metaphysics. The aim is a certain kind of practical knowledge that allows us to live in peace, that allows us not to struggle in life. What would we have to know? Not intellectually, but know in the way that we are, in the way that we view things, such that we don't suffer, such that we're able to be with life in a dynamic way, such that we don't suffer and live in peace. This has to do with immediate experience, which we'll also talk about more later. So the Buddha leads with the path. That's what he wanted to convey. And he states clearly that it leads to peace. So, in case you're interested in peace, the rest of this discourse has more to say about that. So I'll wind up there, and winding up near the end now. And I'd like to know if you have any more questions at this point.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm still ruminating on a wheel in motion. And I sort of went on to a tangent in our little discussion about and using sort of a more current metaphor where the Dharma is where the rubber meets the road, with the wheel turning in that way, and that a lot of times we don't know the terrain that our wheel is going over, especially these days seems very uncertain, but the Dharma seems to be how we meet that moment where the rubber hits the road. Anyway, that was a little joke, in my internal joke amongst myself.
Anything else on your mind?
You know, I can't help but ask, this interpretation of middle as not in between, but rather different, it really is fascinating. I can't say that I've ever heard it before. Is there support in Pali language that the word middle actually means different?
That's a good question. I think we would count this as interpretation. I think the word actually is majje, which does literally mean middle. So I was using it more metaphorically in order to present that. And the evidence I offer is kind of the example that I gave of it's really not about just having one cookie instead of 3 or 0. The middle path, the Eightfold Path is a lot more than that. So maybe for your to play with. Yeah, Ying.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say that for me, what feels important is maybe using an analogy is that I heard from one of the Dharma teachers, and that this image of puppet on the string that being pulled in this way or that way, and this veering from one direction to another. I like this, I don't like this. But this middle way, for me, is a sense of it's no longer playing in that spectrum, or at least we're training to not play in that spectrum. We're going here, going there, going here, going there. Because that's most of the time our minds bounce off like this. The middle is, at least for me, was a sense of that's not the game I'm going to play anymore, as best as we can. Yeah.
And I would just add to that it may not, the etymology may not suggest alternate or different, but in fact, that's what it is. It is an alternate way of meeting experience. So I would just say that is, I think, clearly a suggestion of the text. And there's many different things that are being in different texts contrasted in which there is a alternate way of meeting experience. And so I think that's certainly there in these early texts.
Thank you, David. And maybe I'll wrap us up today with a little bit about what Damon had asked. Well, is there any homework? There isn't any required homework, but if you'd like, if you're interested, I'm going to share screen. Just for me, it's easier to read things than to hear them. And I will also put in chat, but first I'm going to share screen. Here is the name of the sutta. And we're using Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, which is setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. It's a Samyutta Nikaya 5611, setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. So this is what we're going to be talking about for the next 2 times that we meet. And this text is freely available on the website, and I'll put a link to it right now in the chat box if I can get myself organized here.
I just put it there.
Oh, you just did? Perfect. Okay, thank you, David. So not required, but if you're interested and you want to read it and get a sense of where we're going and what's going to be happening in the next few days. So and we called it the dynamic wheel of the Dharma for the name of this class because we liked the alliteration, this sense of this movement, right? It's not just some wheel that's pasted on the wall that we're looking at, but this sense of movement and that we're a part of that too. So maybe with that, we'll close today's class. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to practice together. And if you'd like, you're welcome to unmute so that we can just say goodbye in a cacophonous, disorganized way. Just everybody saying goodbye. There's something about this I kind of love to do. So bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Here, we'll see you
Thank
on
you.
Thursday.
Thursday.
Nice to see you.